She was the richest heiress in England, born into staggering wealth, married to a man connected to every royal house in Europe, and photographed at every glamorous event in the world. And yet the story of Edwina Mountbatten is not the story most people expect. It is the story of a woman who had everything that money and lineage could provide, and who spent her entire life looking for something those things couldn't give her. This is the dramatic marriage of Edwina Mountbatten: love, wealth, and loss. The richest girl in England. Edwina Cynthia. Annette Ashley came into the world on November 28, 1901, in England. Her mother's maiden name was Cassel, as in Sir Ernest Cassel, the German-born financier who had made himself one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Edwardian Britain through an extraordinary talent for investment and an even more extraordinary talent for discretion. Sir Ernest was the personal financial advisor and confidant of King Edward VII, which placed him at the very centre of the most powerful social world in the country. He was Edwina's maternal grandfather, and he adored her. Her mother, Maud Cassel, died when Edwina was 9 years old, and her father, Wilfrid Ashley, who would later become a Conservative Member of Parliament and then a baron, was a remote and largely unengaged presence in her life. She was shipped between relatives and boarding schools, raised in the way that wealthy Edwardian families raised their daughters, with every material advantage and very little warmth. What she had, most consistently, was her grandfather's attention and his affection, and when she spent time at his houses, Brook House on Park Lane in London, or the estate at Branksome Dean in Bournemouth, she was given a sense of being genuinely valued that she struggled to find consistently elsewhere. Sir Ernest Cassel died in September 1921. He was 82 years old, and the will he left behind rearranged the financial landscape of Edwina's life entirely. He left the bulk of his enormous fortune to Edwina, bypassing her father almost entirely. The figure involved was in the region of £2 million at the time, a sum that in today's terms would represent several £100 million. She inherited Brook House on Park Lane, one of the most spectacular private residences in London, a 9-floor marble mansion that Cassel had built at a cost that astonished even his wealthy contemporaries. She inherited country estates. She inherited investments across Europe and beyond. She was 19 years old. Overnight, she became the wealthiest unmarried woman in England, and possibly in all of Europe. This was not simply a financial event. In the Edwardian and post-Edwardian world, a young woman with that degree of independent wealth occupied a position without real precedent. She did not need to marry for money or security. She could refuse suitors entirely. She could travel wherever she wished, live however she pleased, and answer to no one. The freedom that Cassel's inheritance gave her was absolute, in ways that were, for a woman of that era, genuinely unprecedented. The press knew it, society knew it, and every eligible man in the country knew it too. What happened next moved very quickly, as things tended to when money on that scale entered a room. The most glamorous wedding of the century. Louis Francis Albert Victor. Nicholas Mountbatten, known to everyone who loved him as Dickie, was born in June 1900, the youngest child of Prince Louis of Battenberg and Princess Victoria of Hesse. His family was royalty by blood and connection running through half the crowned heads of Europe. His father was German-born and had served as First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, only to be forced to resign at the outbreak of the First World War because of the anti-German hysteria that swept Britain. His great-uncle was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who was murdered along with his entire family in 1918. The Battenberg name itself had been anglicised to Mountbatten during the war, part of the same nationalistic pressure that turned the royal family from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha into Windsor. Dickie Mountbatten was charming, gregarious, physically handsome, and possessed of a driving ambition that was at odds with the easy social confidence he projected in every room he entered. He was determined to build a great naval career, to restore the family name to the prestige his father's forced resignation had cost it, and to do it entirely on his own merits. He was also, by the time he was 19, spending a great deal of time in the company of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, with whom he shared a circle that included parties, social seasons, and all the pleasures that a young man of royal connection and considerable personal charm could access. Dickie and Edwina first met at a ball at Claridge's Hotel in London in October 1920. He was 20, she was 18. By most accounts, the attraction was immediate and genuine on both sides, though the shape of that attraction was complicated from the very beginning. She was extraordinarily wealthy. He was connected to royalty, but personally had very little money of his own. Each had something the other needed, and neither of them would have been naive enough to miss that fact. But there was also, by the testimony of people who watched them together in those early years, something real between them, a connection of temperament and energy and shared ambition that went beyond calculation. Dickie was, by every account, physically striking, charming in an entirely unforced way, and possessed of an energy that matched Edwina's own. He pursued her with determined attention over the months that followed their first meeting, and she responded. They became engaged in August 1921, the same month that her grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassell, who had watched the courtship with cautious approval, gave the match his blessing. He would not live to see them married. They became engaged in August 1921. Sir Ernest Cassell, who had been cautiously approving of the match, died before he could see them married. The wedding was held on July 18th, 1922, at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster, the church that stands in the shadow of Westminster Abbey and that has hosted some of the most significant society weddings in English history. What happened that day was genuinely extraordinary by any measure. More than 8,000 people gathered in the streets outside to catch a glimpse of the couple. Queen Mary was there. Queen Alexandra was there. The Prince of Wales served as Dickie's best man. Contemporary newspapers did not need to reach for hyperbole. They called it the wedding of the year and meant it sincerely. A Pathé newsreel film was made of the occasion. Souvenir programs were printed and distributed. The streets of Westminster were lined with crowds the size of which would normally be associated with a state occasion. The honeymoon was correspondingly spectacular. They toured European royal courts, visited the great houses of the continent's aristocracy, and eventually made their way to the United States. In New York, they were received with the kind of attention that the city reserved for genuinely famous arrivals. They visited Niagara Falls, because, as Edwina noted with her characteristic dry wit, all honeymooners went there. In California, they spent time with Charlie Chaplin, who made a private short film featuring the two of them called Nice and Friendly. It was never commercially released, but its existence gives some sense of the world the Mountbattens occupied in those earliest years of their marriage, a world of royalty, celebrity, extraordinary wealth, and access to virtually everything. The couple returned to England and began building their shared life. Edwina used her inheritance to transform Brooke House into one of the most fashionable addresses in London, redecorating it with a flair and expense that impressed even their wealthy contemporaries. She and Dickie entertained constantly. Their social circle included members of the royal family, figures from the political world, artists, entertainers, and the international aristocracy that still defined the social summit of the interwar era. From the outside, the Mountbatten marriage looked like everything a fairy tale was supposed to look like. Two young, glamorous, connected people with the resources to live exactly as they chose, doing exactly that. It was also, from almost the very beginning, a marriage that was going to require both of them to be something other than what the fairy tale version of that wedding day implied. The open marriage nobody talked about. Within a few years of the wedding, it had become clear, to the people around them, if not yet to the wider public, that the Mountbatten marriage was not a conventional one. Edwina, with her grandfather's fortune, was free in a way that almost no woman of her generation and class was free. She could go where she liked, fund what she liked, associate with whom she liked. And what she liked, throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, was a life conducted at a pace and intensity that shocked even the permissive social world of the interwar years. She had affairs, many of them, and some of them with people whose presence in her life would have detonated careers and reputations if they had become fully public. She was involved with Paul Robeson, the celebrated African-American singer and actor, a relationship whose racial dimension, in the Britain of the 1920s and 1930s, was considered by the establishment to be as scandalous as the infidelity itself. She was linked to various European aristocrats, diplomats, and entertainers on both sides of the Atlantic. She was said by those who knew her in this period to be restless in a way that no amount of activity ever quite satisfied, always arriving at parties, always looking for the next thing, always radiating an energy that people found either thrilling or exhausting, depending on their own constitution. The press watched her with fascination and occasional outrage. The gossip columns tracked her movements. The social world she moved through, which straddled London, the French Riviera, New York, and the palaces of European royalty, was simultaneously scandalized and magnetized. She was not entirely careless about the consequences. She understood the rules of the game well enough to keep the worst of it from producing formal public exposure. But she was also not particularly interested in those rules for their own sake, and the people who knew her well understood that. Dickie had his own involvements, though his were conducted with somewhat more discretion. The marriage they arrived at, over time, was an open one, a genuine arrangement between two adults who had agreed, tacitly and then explicitly, that fidelity as conventionally understood was not going to be part of what they offered each other. What they did offer each other was something more durable: loyalty, partnership, a shared project, and a genuine mutual affection that survived everything else intact. Biographers who have studied the Mountbattens most carefully describe a relationship that was at once genuinely loving and genuinely unconventional. Two people who were, in some deep sense, each other's most constant companion, and who were also never really faithful to each other in any traditional sense. Andrew Looney, whose biography of the couple is the most comprehensive account of their marriage, describes them as having reached an understanding early on that the alternative to this arrangement was divorce. And that divorce, for two people of their position and connections, would have been far more destructive to their shared project than any number of affairs. So they chose the arrangement, and they maintained it across almost 4 decades, and they apparently found within it something that sustained them both. An FBI file from 1944, declassified decades later, describes the Mountbattens as persons of extremely low morals. American intelligence had been observing prominent British figures during the war years with considerable attention, and the file suggests that both Edwina and Dickie maintained relationships that, by the standards of that era, went well beyond what polite society acknowledged as possible. Both of them kept this dimension of their lives tightly guarded from public view. Not perfectly, as the FBI file demonstrates, but effectively enough that it did not become public knowledge during their lifetimes. But what the affairs and the FBI file and the gossip columns could not capture was the remarkable transformation that was about to overtake Edwina Mountbatten during the Second World War. A transformation that would turn the restless socialite of the interwar years into one of the most effective and fearless relief workers in Britain's wartime history. The war that changed everything. The Britain that went to war in September 1939 was a different country from the one that had celebrated the Mountbatten wedding 17 years earlier. The social world of cocktail parties and European tours and Charlie Chaplin films had been swept away by economic depression and political catastrophe. And what the war years demanded was something entirely different from what Edwina had been offering the world in her first 2 decades of public life. She threw herself into it. Edwina became Superintendent-in-Chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade, one of the largest voluntary nursing and first aid organisations in Britain. She did not simply take the title and attend the occasional ceremonial function. She worked, constantly and seriously, in a manner that nobody who had known her in the 1920s would have predicted. She inspected hospitals and field stations. She organised the distribution of medical supplies across territories that were actively under fire. She flew into war zones. She turned up in places where active combat was ongoing and where the physical danger was real. And she worked regardless of the danger in a way that eventually earned her genuine respect from the military professionals alongside whom she operated. She was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1943. She was appointed a Dame Commander of the Royal Victorian Order in 1946. These were not ceremonial honours of the kind that wealth and connection automatically produce. They were recognition of specific, substantial, documented work in the service of injured and displaced people during the most destructive conflict in human history. Those who worked alongside her during this period described a woman transformed. The Edwina of the 1920s, who had thrown parties at Brooke House that lasted until dawn and spent months on the French Riviera, was barely recognisable in the Edwina of the early 1940s. She had found, apparently for the first time in her life, work that both required everything she had and that gave her something back in proportion to what she gave it. The organisational demands of running a major voluntary medical organisation across a country at war were real, and she met them. The physical demands, the travel, the inspections, the insistence on going personally into situations that a woman of her position and wealth could easily have observed at a comfortable remove, were also real, and she met those too. Her willingness to do the actual work, rather than the representative version of it, changed how people around her understood her. Officers who had been skeptical, colleagues who had assumed she was a society figurehead taking a wartime title, revised their assessments as they watched her work. She was not performing dedication. She was demonstrating it. Meanwhile, Dickie's own wartime career was ascending in ways that would eventually place both of them at the centre of one of the most consequential political events of the 20th century. He commanded HMS Kelly in the Norwegian campaign and the Battle of Crete, and the ships sinking in 1941, dramatised in the 1942 film In Which We Serve, made by his friend Noel Coward with Mountbatten's active cooperation, became one of the defining images of British naval courage under extreme pressure. He was appointed Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia in 1943, with responsibility for coordinating Allied operations across one of the most complex and difficult theatres of the Pacific War. By the time the war ended in 1945, both Mountbattens had been genuinely tested, and both had demonstrated capacities that their pre-war lives had given no particular reason to expect. The question of what came next, for Britain and for the Empire it had spent enormous human and material resources defending, was about to bring them to a moment that would define both of their lives forever. and that would produce, in Edwina's case, the most remarkable relationship she had ever known. The Viceroy's wife and the future Prime Minister. In February 1947, Prime Minister Clement Attlee appointed Louis Mountbatten as the last Viceroy of India, charged with overseeing the transfer of power from British colonial rule to Indian self-governance. It was an appointment of extraordinary complexity and pressure. The British Empire was withdrawing from the subcontinent, and what that withdrawal would look like. Who would be left with what? Where the borders between the new nations of India and Pakistan would be drawn, and at what speed. All of these questions were live, lethal, and demanded resolution within months rather than years. When Dickie arrived in Delhi on March 22, 1947, Edwina was with him. She was not there as decoration. She had brought her wartime experience, her organizational ability, and her complete indifference to personal danger, and she immediately began working, visiting refugee camps, meeting with relief organizations, going into areas that nobody else in her position would have entered. Her willingness to walk directly into the most desperate situations, without apparent concern for her own safety, astonished the Indian officials and military personnel who observed it. And it did more to build goodwill between the Mountbattens and the Indian population than any number of official receptions could have managed. It was at a rally in Singapore that the meeting happened, the one that would change everything for Edwina. She was knocked down in a surge of the crowd. In the chaos, two men pushed through to help her: Dickie and Jawaharlal Nehru, the leading figure of the Indian National Congress and the man who would become India's first Prime Minister. The incident led to the three of them dining together that evening, and a conversation that, as Dickie later recalled, ranged across everything. The friendship between the Mountbattens and Nehru grew quickly from there. And within weeks, it was apparent that for Edwina and Nehru specifically, the friendship had become something considerably deeper. Nehru was 57 years old, widowed since 1936, when his wife Kamala had died of tuberculosis, a man of enormous intellectual breadth and personal magnetism, who had spent years in British prisons for his role in the independence movement without losing either his dignity or his convictions. He was a graduate of Harrow and Trinity College, Cambridge. He had read voraciously throughout his imprisonments, emerging from each with a deeper and more carefully formed understanding of history, philosophy, and the nature of political change. He was, by every account of those who knew him, extraordinarily compelling. Not in a superficial way, but in the manner of someone whose inner life was so rich and whose engagement with ideas was so genuine that spending time with him was an experience unlike spending time with almost anyone else. Edwina, who had spent decades moving through a social world populated largely by people whose inner lives were considerably less interesting than their wardrobes, responded to him with a depth of feeling she had apparently not experienced before. The physical circumstances of their first real conversation had been unusual enough to constitute its own kind of introduction. Two people who had just helped each other through a dangerous situation, in a country on the edge of enormous upheaval, dining together afterward and discovering that they could talk about everything. That was the phrase Dickie used later when he described that first evening. They talked about everything under the sun. It was, in other words, not a dinner between the Viceroy's wife and a political figure. It was the beginning of something else. What exactly passed between them, whether the relationship was physical in addition to emotional and intellectual, has been debated by historians for more than 70 years. Nehru consistently denied that anything improper had occurred. He described their connection as one of spiritual understanding, of two people who recognized something fundamental in each other across all the barriers of culture and circumstance that separated them. Edwina's daughter Pamela, who knew both her mother and Nehru well, and who lived through this period at close quarters, maintained throughout her long life that the relationship had never crossed into a physical affair. And yet, the letters that Nehru wrote to Edwina, handwritten always, in contrast to the typed letters he sent to virtually everyone else, including Dickie, suggest an emotional intimacy of a particular quality. Dickie himself, who had excellent reasons to know more than anyone else about the nature of his wife's relationships, believed entirely that the connection between Edwina and Nehru was physical as well as emotional. He was, according to people who knew him, not troubled by this so much as genuinely proud of it. Proud that his wife had captured the affection of a man of Nehru's stature. The photograph that Henri Cartier-Bresson captured during this period, Nehru bent over laughing, gazing at Edwina with undisguised admiration, while Dickie stands at the edge of the frame with the ghost of a knowing smile, has become one of the iconic images of the late colonial era precisely because it shows, in a single unguarded moment, all three dimensions of a triangle that nobody officially acknowledged. Meanwhile, the political work continued. The partition of India and Pakistan, formalized in August 1947, produced one of the largest and most traumatic mass displacements in human history. An estimated 10 to 14 million people forced to move across newly drawn borders, with violence that killed hundreds of thousands and possibly more. In the chaos, Edwina worked without pause. She was on the ground in the refugee camps, negotiating with relief agencies, driving logistics, being present in ways that were simultaneously practically effective and symbolically important. She was the vice-reine of the departing colonial power, working alongside the people that power had governed, and her willingness to do it without condescension or ceremony earned her a respect that crossed the political and cultural lines that defined everything else about that moment. The partition itself, formalized in August 1947 with the drawing of the Radcliffe Line that divided British India into the new nations of India and Pakistan, produced a human catastrophe of staggering proportions. Somewhere between 10 and 14 million people were forced to flee their homes and cross the new borders in both directions. Hindus and Sikhs moving into India, Muslims moving into Pakistan. The violence that accompanied this displacement killed hundreds of thousands, and by some estimates, considerably more. Trains arrived at stations with their passengers already dead. Villages were burned. Families were separated and never reunited. In the middle of all of this, Edwina was working. She drove into areas that were actively dangerous. She negotiated with relief organizations. She walked through refugee camps that contained more suffering than any single person could process, and she processed it anyway, and she kept working. The Indian officials who watched her do this, men who had every reason to be hostile to the wife of the man overseeing the end of British rule, were visibly moved by what they saw. She was not there to be seen. She was there to help, and the difference between the two things was legible in everything she did. When the Mountbattens left India in June 1948, crowds lined the streets to see them go. Garlands were thrown. People wept openly. It was an extraordinary departure for the representatives of a departing colonial authority, and it was largely attributable to what Edwina had given to India in those final months. She had walked into the chaos without flinching, and the country knew it. Edwina returned to India every year after that until she died. Nehru wrote to her constantly, and the connection between them, whatever its precise nature, remained one of the central emotional facts of both their lives until the end. The letters and the final years. After India, Edwina Mountbatten threw herself back into her relief work with an energy that, in a woman entering her late 40s and then her 50s, was remarkable even to people who had watched her in the war years. She was now Superintendent-in-Chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade at a global scale. and she treated the role with the same unsparing commitment she had brought to every serious endeavor in her life. She continued traveling constantly, to war zones, to disaster areas, to refugee camps, to any place where medical supplies and organizational skill and the presence of someone with the authority to cut through bureaucracy could make a difference to people in desperate need. Her daughter Pamela later described a mother who seemed to feel genuinely alive only when she was working at this kind of intensity, who found in the relief work not just purpose, but the particular quality of complete engagement that had previously eluded her. She travelled to Malaya, to Singapore, to East Africa, to the Middle East, to wherever the work took her, and she always found more work than there was time to do. She was in her late 50s, and she was operating at a pace that exhausted people 30 years younger. Photographs from those years show a woman who looked elegant and composed in the way that women of her generation and class were trained to look, but also visibly thinner and more tired than the photographs from earlier decades. The pace she was sustaining was not sustainable. The people who loved her knew it. She didn't slow down. Through all of it, the correspondence with Nehru continued. His letters arrived regularly, handwritten, personal, revealing a degree of intimacy that he maintained with no one else in quite the same way. Hers went back to him with equal frequency. They met when circumstances allowed, in India, in England, wherever their paths crossed in the great movements of the post-war world. She never lost the connection, and neither did he. Dickie's own career had continued at the highest levels: Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral of the Fleet, the most senior military officer in Britain. The marriage remained what it had always been: an unconventional partnership between two people who were genuinely devoted to each other in a way that had very little to do with conventional fidelity, and a great deal to do with a shared history, a shared ambition, and a genuine mutual regard that decades of separation and multiple other attachments had not eroded. In February 1960, Edwina was in Jesselton, North Borneo, now known as Kota Kinabalu in Malaysia, on a tour of inspection for the St. John Ambulance Brigade. She had been working across the region for weeks in the way she always worked, fully, without complaint, demanding more of herself than the people around her were comfortable watching her demand. On the evening of February 20th, 1960, she had dinner with the governor of North Borneo, Sir Roland Turnbull. She appeared in good health. She retired to her bedroom at Government House at around 11 o'clock at night. She did not wake up. On the morning of February 21st, 1960, what would have been her 282nd day of continuous work on that tour, her maid entered her bedroom and found her. She had died peacefully in her sleep. She was 58 years old. Beside her on the bed, where she had apparently been reading them the night before, was a pile of letters. They were Nehru's, every one of them. When the news reached London, Dickie described it as a poleaxe blow. He received more than 8,000 letters of condolence from members of the public. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who had known Edwina all her life, delivered the observation that has followed the story ever since, remarking, with the combination of affection and wry understanding that only someone who had known her intimately could have managed, that dear Edwina had always liked to make a splash. When the news reached India, Nehru ordered the Indian Navy frigate INS Trishul, which happened to be in the area and was undergoing repairs, to divert and escort the ship carrying Edwina's body, and to cast a wreath as it passed. It was a gesture from the Prime Minister of a sovereign nation for the widow of the last viceroy of the colonial power that had governed them. A gesture that could only have been explained by the specific, irreplaceable nature of what Edwina Mountbatten had been to him. She was buried at sea, in the English Channel, as she had requested. Her gross personal estate was valued at just over £500,000 at the time of her death, considerably less than the fortune she had inherited from her grandfather, spent freely across a lifetime of extraordinary living and also of genuine humanitarian service. Dickie is reported to have noted, to friends, that after death duties, his net inheritance from her estate amounted to something very close to nothing. What she left behind. The children she left behind were two daughters, Patricia, born in 1924, and Pamela, born in 1929. Both daughters lived long and distinguished lives. Patricia became Lady Browborn and was herself a grandmother when she survived the same IRA attack in 1979 that killed her father, a boat bomb that detonated while the family were fishing off the coast of Ireland. She died in 2017 at 93. Pamela Mountbatten, also known as Pamela Hicks, who died in 2017, remained throughout her life the most vocal defender of her mother's reputation, consistently maintaining that Edwina's relationship with Nehru, though deeply intimate and genuinely unique, had never crossed into a physical affair. Whether that was the complete truth, or a daughter's love for her mother's memory, or some combination of the two, was never definitively resolved. What Pamela did acknowledge, in interviews and in her own memoir, was that her mother and Nehru had shared something real, something that had sustained both of them through years and across enormous distances, something that had been more important to Edwina than almost anything else in her life. Nehru himself survived Edwina by 4 years. He died in May 1964 in New Delhi of a stroke. He had continued to govern India throughout those 4 years, remaining its most consequential political figure, but those who were close to him noted a change after Edwina was gone, a quietness, a dimension of his personal life that had been animated by her presence and that her absence left unfilled. He never remarried, and the connection he had maintained with Edwina was never replicated with anyone else. His biographers note that his correspondence with her represents some of the most personally revealing letters he ever wrote, that in writing to Edwina, he allowed himself a degree of openness and warmth that his public role and his political responsibilities made unavailable in other contexts. They were the letters of a man who had found, in a woman who was officially the representative of a colonial power his entire career had been spent opposing, something that transcended every category those roles implied. Dickie Mountbatten survived Edwina by 19 years. He continued his naval career and his public life, remained a central figure in the British establishment, and became a beloved figure to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the royal family. In 1979, while on a fishing trip at his estate at Mullaghmore in the west of Ireland, he was killed by a bomb planted by the Provisional IRA. It detonated on his boat, the Shadow V, on August 27, 1979. He was 79 years old. The attack killed 3 others, including his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull. The marriage of Edwina and Lewis Mountbatten lasted from 1922 to her death in 1960, 38 years. It was not a conventional marriage, and nobody who knew them would have described it as one. It was a partnership between 2 extraordinarily ambitious people who occupied adjacent positions at the centre of the British world during one of the most turbulent periods in that world's history. It was also, in its own unconventional terms, a genuine love story, the story of 2 people who needed each other in ways they couldn't entirely explain and couldn't imagine doing without. The fortune that Sir Ernest Cassell had left to his granddaughter had given her a freedom that almost no woman of her generation possessed. She used that freedom recklessly at times, brilliantly at others. She spent it on parties and lovers, and travel in the 1920s and on hospitals and refugee camps and night crossings into dangerous territory in the 1940s and 1950s. She spent it on the renovations of Brooke House and on the logistics of emergency medical relief across 3 continents. She had the Nehru letters beside her when she died, the correspondence that represented the deepest emotional connection of her adult life, with a man she had met at the precise moment when 2 nations were being separated from each other, who wrote to her by hand when he wrote to everyone else by typewriter, and who diverted a naval frigate to cast a wreath into the sea when she was gone. She had wanted, throughout her life, to be seen and known and genuinely loved, and she had pursued that want with a ferocity that shocked the people around her and exhausted the social conventions of 3 different decades. She had also, in the process, done more concrete good for more desperate people than most of the respectable figures who found her behaviour scandalous could have claimed for themselves. That was Edwina Mountbatten. Not a simple story, not a comfortable one, but an extraordinary one, entirely her own, lived at full volume from the first day to the last. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.